Wonderful. Thank you, Ellen. Well, we're very, very happy to have you today. We have our training and webinar in partnership with AIA Oregon Digital Design Series. And today we'll be discussing what we have affectionately coined the trifecta of carbon commitments. And I want to introduce my wonderful colleague, Naomi, who works with me on the New Buildings Energy Trust program. She's going to share a little bit more about the trifecta and introduce our different presenters today. But just quickly to share with you, what is Energy Trust? Well, Energy Trust is an independent not-for-profit that is dedicated to helping utility customers both invest in and obviously benefit from what we all care about today, and that's energy efficiency and clean renewable power. We provide a whole host of things, including information, technical studies, engineering studies, cash incentives, contractor connections, and these net zero grants, which you'll hear more about. And these all are for our customers of Portland General Electric, Pacific Power, Northwest Natural, Cascade Natural Gas in Southwest Washington and Oregon, and Avista. So if I can have my colleague Naomi, who is managing our Net Zero Grants program, if you'll share a little bit about what that is and how people can get involved.
Thanks, Kriya. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon. My name is Naomi Cole, and I work with Energy Trust and the New Buildings program on how to advance the market. And what you're going to hear about today are some of the critical market transformation initiatives that are happening on a national, if not international level. And Kriya, I can't see the other slides. I don't know if it's just me or if the deck needs to change. Some of the work that I do around transforming the market is, as Kriya mentioned, net zero grants. And so we're going to tell you just a little bit about this. We fund research fellowships for practitioners to conduct research to address barriers that they've identified in their day-to-day work. And so we've supported architects, developers, engineers, community development corporations, energy modelers to tackle some of these critical challenges that we know are barriers for moving the industry towards higher performing buildings. And we award 1 to 2 grants every year. It opens every spring. And the other grant that we have awards funds to engineering and architecture firms to hire interns to advance these national carbon commitments, which we're going to talk about today. So check out our website for more information about those opportunities. And in the next slide, I wanted to just make a pitch for previous research and presentations from some of the interns that have worked on these national carbon commitment internships, and encourage you to take a look at that. And there are recorded on-demand trainings for previous fellowship work, and you can get continuing education credits for those. Next. Okay, but on to the main topic of today, which is about carbon in buildings and how to get to net zero emissions. And we recognize that people are coming from a range of backgrounds, so wanted to just do a little bit of level setting and carbon 101, because you're going to hear a lot about embodied and operational carbon emissions today. So embodied carbon are the emissions associated with all the stuff that goes into buildings. So the manufacturing, transportation, and installation of construction materials. Operational carbon, of course, are the emissions associated with operations or what come from energy consumption. And Architecture 2030, that's here today and is really the national organization that helped launch and kickstart all of this work, has found that if we continue on a business as usual path, by 2050, about 50% of the carbon emissions from buildings will be from operational carbon and 50% from embodied carbon. And of course, as the grid gets cleaner and buildings get more efficient, the embodied carbon becomes a bigger piece of the pie, which is why it's being talked about more and more in the industry. So that's the basics. You got it now. Okay, so what we're here to talk about today are these 3 really awesome national initiatives that are focused on moving the industry towards net zero carbon emissions. And you'll hear about the AIA 2030 commitment, led by American Institute of Architects, the MEP 2040 commitment, led by the Carbon Leadership Forum, and SE 2050, led by the Structural Engineering Institute. And all of these initiatives challenge their network by a certain date that's in the title of the commitment to achieve net zero emissions by that date. And so There's some similarities. AIA 2030 has been around for a long time, and the two engineering initiatives developed in the last several years. But they all have this commitment to net zero emissions. They all have some type of sustainability or carbon plan. They all have some type of annual reporting or deliverable requirement. And we now have signatories for all of these commitments in Oregon. There's been a tremendous momentum in the two engineering initiatives just in the last couple of years. And so you can see from the numbers here, this is not all of the firms in Oregon. These are still kind of leading edge initiatives. And it's not, as you'll hear about today, it's not an insignificant.
Naomi, sorry, you've accidentally been muted.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah, so as you can see by the number of signatories, and as you'll hear from the requirements and the panelists that are about to jump on, it's not an insignificant level of effort to meet the commitment requirements and change the way designers practice and some of the decisions that are made about buildings. But we are seeing great momentum and a lot more firms in Oregon and the Northwest and around the country signing on and saying they're all into achieving net zero emissions. So with that, I want to introduce a couple folks, and the plan for today is pretty informal. You're going to hear from a representative of a firm that has signed on to each of these commitments. I've got a few initial questions to get us started, and then we have plenty of time for Q&A. It's meant to be super informal. We'll take down slides in a few minutes, and when you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or once we're getting to the discussion, you're also welcome to unmute yourself and jump in. But first of all, I want to introduce a special guest. So we've got Vincent Martinez here from Architecture 2030, which is the organization that started this all. And Vincent is going to participate and respond to some of the questions, and also come in a little bit towards the end and talk about an initiative that's starting to find more alignment across these three commitments, particularly around embodied carbon. So Vincent, if you want to jump on and say hi and a little bit more about your role and organization, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Naomi, and appreciate AIA Oregon and the other participants for inviting me to join you all today. So I'm the President and Chief Operating Officer for Architecture 2030, and I have the fortunate privilege to have been with the organization since we founded as a nonprofit in 2006. So I've been with it since the beginning of the 2030 Challenge, which then was adopted and turned into the 2030 Commitment by the AIA, and has been the instigator of all of the other commitments to follow. And I'll talk a little bit more about those that actually beyond these three in the broader built environment space as well when we get a little bit later in the conversation. But this is really amazing to see how many firms have signed on to all of these commitments. It's really showing the private sector leadership in the space, and that helps also do the dance with public policy. And so when public policy is how we get to scale on all of this stuff, and when you see that firms are actually able to do it and report on it and show progress, that's when you see public policy raise the floor. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and how some of that alignment is related to not just industry organizations and alignment with them, but with policymakers and some of the latest embodied carbon and operational carbon and whole life carbon policies that are coming up in different cities and states and countries.
Thanks, Vincent. Okay. So I also want to introduce Mia Kalatzis, who's with Studio E Architecture, a firm that is an AIA 2030 signatory. And then also Ante Volin, who's with GluMac, an MEP 2040 signatory, and Jessica Martinez with DCI Engineers, an SE 2050 signatory. So they're going to get started by telling you a little bit more about each of these commitments, what their firm has signed on to, and a little bit about their experience with reporting. So Mia, take it away.
All right. Thanks for having me. I have been a part of the AIA commitment for now 3 years. I'm a designer here at Studio E Architecture, and Studio E has been designing and high performance passive houses for about over 2 decades. And they initially had signed on to the commitment in 2018, but hadn't committed to reporting until 2023 when we applied for the Net Zero Emerging Leadership Internship Grant. And that grant allowed us to explore the AIA commitment in more depth and begin reporting and recording our projects. So just to kind of jump in. The initial kind of all of the information felt very daunting in the beginning. But as we kind of, went through all of the requirements, it seemed more achievable. Our firm is a firm of 5 people, so 5 to 7 people. So it being a smaller firm, and it's as sustainability is part of our passion, we have to work really hard to make sure we can incorporate pushing that to the forefront and not succumbing to kind of typical practices. So just kind of some of the basic commitments when you sign on is just to create a letter and sign on with as your firm, create a sustainability action plan, which we think of as kind of a roadmap to reflecting on our goals every year, and really use it as a tool to reflect on. And then along with that is just the DDX design data exchange database. That's where we log our projects, and that can be logged project by project individually or as bulk entry for larger firms, which is helpful. Along with logging projects, the minimum recording requirements for logging projects is quite simple. It consists of project name, location, design phase, use type, building area, energy, EUI, predicted EUI, and then it can be estimated with the AIA 0 tool to kind of get that. So AIA has a lot of tools that make kind of some of those daunting calculations seem more achievable. So essentially, those are the majority of the requirements, and then you're a part of this design database exchange where you can compare your results with yearly signatories. So I can speak to the AIA program as someone who reports projects yearly, and then who has been part of the Net Zero Emerging Leadership Grant for the last 3 years as an intern, and then as a mentor as well. So I can speak to that.
Thanks, Mia. Ante?
Thanks. I'm Ante Volin, a senior sustainability strategist at GluMac. GluMac is a consulting engineering firm with a presence here in Portland and also up and down the West Coast. Our drive to participate in these commitments, and I say commitments because we're both signatories to AIA 2030 and MEP 2040, is to start to walk the walk and really prove that as engineers for a sustainable future, we're actually making more sustainable buildings. So we've been doing our reporting since the 2022 cycle, but it actually took us until just this summer to officially finalize our company plan, because we wanted to be really thoughtful and intentional about that. A goal without a plan is just a wish, I guess is the old saying. And so for us, we really had to figure out how we could actually connect these goals and ideals to our design processes. So there's a huge amount of buy-in it took to just get through that first requirement of MEP 2040 of having a plan. And so we're excited now to tie our reporting that's already been going on to that. The other aspects are a little less intense, but very important. We commit to requesting low global warming potential refrigerants on the systems that we design, and actually try to reduce refrigerant emissions from buildings, since that's a non-trivial source of greenhouse gases. We also are looking into requesting environmental product declarations, getting that data about the embodied carbon of systems that we design and specify. And the most fun part is participating in the MEP quarterly forums. They're really great opportunities, especially to connect with a national network and get a sense of what's going on with talented engineers all across the country, and then participating in smaller discussion groups. For example, I participated in one for data analysis and reporting, and that's led to some great results. Like there's a refrigerant impact calculator released under the auspices of MEP 2040 that lets you compare different data sets about, how much you can expect to see leak from different types of equipment. So it's really those 4 spheres. We see that they connect to what we consider to be our purpose. And so we're really excited to be on board, and we're excited to encourage other people to get there. I think there's about 14 signatory firms in Oregon in the consulting engineering world. Don't get mad if I might have missed your firm in the count, but we're excited to see that grow over the years.
Thanks. And Jessica.
Thanks, Naomi. So SE 2050, and yes, and I need to introduce myself first. I'm sorry about that. Yes, my name is Jessica Martinez. I am a part of the SE 2050 commitment, and a part of that through DCI Engineers. We are primarily a structural engineering firm, and I am our company structural sustainability specialist. So with that, I really oversee our company-wide sustainability efforts, with a strong focus on educating staff on best practices as related to sustainability and primarily embodied carbon. We also advocate for decarbonization of the built environment, and I very much assist with embodied carbon reductions at the project level and lead our life cycle assessment capabilities. But enough about me. We're here to learn about SE 2050, and so I do want to just show this first slide here, just to kind of show how simple it is with what SE 2050 is trying to do. Essentially, we are trying to reach net zero embodied carbon in our structures by the year 2050, and that all starts with creating a commitment letter similar to the other commitments that just talked on their points as well. And so this was one area I know that was a bit tricky for us, being a larger firm. We have about 20 plus offices across the entire country. And so getting everybody on board with that commitment was a little tricky. With us being engineers, we really wanted to make sure we were going to be able to meet this commitment and really, you know, come at it strongly back whenever we signed on in 2021. So once we were all, you know, on the same page and convinced that, yes, we're going to do this and we're going to meet this goal together, that really kind of put us over the hump. And so after that initial, you know, introduction commitment to the program, it really has an annual cycle that goes on and on moving forward. So you can see here that every year we issue an embodied carbon action plan, and we issue and submit project data to the SE 2050 database. If we go to the next slide, this really shows the 4 core tenets that we have at SE 2050 and the main areas that we focus on as a commitment. So the first being education. There is requirements for each of these tenets whenever you are putting together your embodied carbon action plan, but they also provide a lot of electives so that different firms of different sizes and, you know, specialties are able to meet the commitment in the way that feels most natural and, you know, successful for them to tap into. So on the education side, the requirements are selecting an embodied carbon champion to help influence ongoing education for the company, really ensuring that all of that knowledge is disseminated across the entire staff, and so that we can all work as a united front through the company. There's you know, some more electives that I have listed here if you want to read through those, but the other tenets, moving to the right, we have reporting. This is the part that we are effectively reporting our data every year and uploading it to the database. So every year we are required to submit 2 projects per office or 5 max total. So this also requires a standardized embodied carbon measurement and reporting plan. And so we can make sure we're comparing apples to apples, and the SE 2050 database is also comparing apples to apples when they're getting that data. And the idea is that over time, this project reporting frequency will continue and start to grow over time. And so that those numbers can become even more, you know, that can be worked into our workflow on all projects. And there's also knowledge sharing, which is all about advocacy, really declaring your commitment to SE 2050 and sharing your lessons learned with your peers and trying to help move the needle on future projects. And there's also reduction, which is another really big core tenet here, and that is establishing a reduction plan, really assessing, you know, the data that was uploaded in the previous year, considering all the education and advocacy that happened throughout the past year, and really, you know, taking in and laying out some next steps so that the firm can continue to drive down those reductions and meet our goal of net zero structures.
Thank you. All right. Well, I think we can take down the slides and just have a bit of a conversation. And so the first question for all of you is to tell us a little bit about some of the best practices that you now follow to meet these commitment requirements. What are you doing differently at your firms as designers?
Well, I'll say one thing that we've started doing is trying to make this commitment visible in some of our earliest deliverables to our client. So some of this information and about benchmarking building performance or mentioning refrigerant stuff, that it shows up in things like an SD narrative in a way that it connects to, not that every owner or architect is reading every part of those things, but it's there, and that we center it in our design process. And so that takes time in any organization, to standardize approaches, to put out templates and socialize it. But that's really how we try to get started. And then track that through checklists and other project management tools, but really just trying to get it into our earliest deliverables as a way to kind of then make it lead to actual impact.
I think I can piggyback off of Ante with that. I think a big part of it is educating the client, and you really have to advocate for the materials that are used on projects, and we'll argue for and against materials constantly. Other good practices we try to incorporate now is just using less materials in general, now being pretty conscious of embodied carbon. And along with that is also requesting EPDs as much as possible, as that's still a huge barrier within the market, and a lack of an LCA reports on products and materials. So it's a big piece of the puzzle that we really need to drive the industry to work on.
Yeah, and I'll chime in from the structural design perspective that we have at DCI. Like I mentioned earlier, we have quite a few offices, and they're spread all across the country with varying, appetites for sustainability. So I think one of the big messages that I try to preach internally is just really trying to empower our engineers to continue doing the good work that they're doing, but to understand that, like, the great power that they have in terms of embodied carbon and their impact as designers. Engineers love a good problem solving, exercise. And so throwing embodied carbon and sustainability into the mix is something that historically we haven't really been challenged to focus on as structural engineers. And so it's really exciting to show the engineers that they have those, those opportunities to impact the carbon footprint of the building, and really watching them kind of take off on their own. We can try to, we have updated, our general note and specification templates to ask for EPDs and establish GWP limits. But it really doesn't do any good unless the engineers feel like they're confident and able to have those conversations. So I think right now that is the biggest effort that we are trying to do on, getting that conversation started. And then also on the back end, with us being a larger firm, we have a separate BIM department, which really affects how we do our reporting capabilities. And so there's a lot of coordination that goes back and forth and trying to see how we can implement this into our everyday workflow. So there's a lot of different efforts that we're focusing on, but I think that those two are probably the biggest ones that I put my eggs in the basket for.
I could offer something too. I mean, at least we might hear from all the firms that are starting to look at these commitments and have looked at them over time. I'm sure Energy Trust talks about you can't manage what you don't measure. It's the same thing here with firms that have now been into this for multiple years, tracking projects. And I think originally when we were looking at things, let's say on the operational side, it was energy modeling. And energy modeling originally, looked back over 2 decades ago, and it was used just for code compliance or sort of at the end as sort of an exercise. And you're saying now whole building life cycle assessment or embodied carbon calculations that are being used upfront in the design process. So earlier and earlier, and looking at them as comparative models and trying to learn from what we learned from the last project and apply it to the next project. So I think that's one of the real big benefits, and that was something that we've seen across more and more firms, is they are improving over time because they're looking at the data, they're tracking it more up throughout the entire design process, not just at the end.
Yeah, that's great insight. So I guess a little bit of a follow-up, now that, your firms have been at this for several years, like what's still really hard and what feels pretty easy and sort of second nature now for firms that are, trying to get over the hump of like getting started. They know what's going to be hard, but what gets easier, what remains hard, or what new stuff is coming at you that feels hard.
Well, I'll say one of the things that remains hard, and we keep thinking technology is going to make it easier, is getting the actual data about how buildings are performed. So it's very easy for us to have model data or to use our reports that we've done for energy trust incentives and things like that. But it just even though in theory everyone wants to know this data, the owner, the tenants, just so hard to get your hands on that. So much of our data that we report is not actual, but we would love to make that better. I think it's tough, and maybe on the structural engineering side, just like it's a little easier because someone's actually out there physically buying all that steel and concrete, and they can tell you exactly how much there is there. But that's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, and I'd say, I mean, you're right. It is the only thing I think the hardest part for us is, or at least for myself, I know, is really just being patient and being comfortable with being uncomfortable. There's a lot of changes that are happening with this data and research and processes every other week, it seems like, if not every day. And I know that we just really want to start asking for EPDs on every project, setting GWP limits for every single project, and getting very accurate with our analyses. But really just honestly pulling back, having the conversations, collaborating on projects, and discussing these concepts at a high level can get us very far as well. We don't need to completely flip a switch overnight, although I would love to. It takes time to make change, and so it's just being, I think, patient and really just continuing to help encourage others to learn more, and opening those minds and continue sharing the message is the best that I can do on being patient.
So I think that the hardest part for our firm is kind of what Vince had touched on, is energy modeling and integrating that into every project. As a small firm, that's nearly impossible currently for us. We have a lot of passive houses, so yearly there's one or two energy models that will at least contain operational energy and kind of finite lens on kind of the project at that scope. But for the majority of our projects, we're kind of operating on our results from those passive houses and kind of best practices as rules of thumbs. And we kind of were pretty elated in 2023 when we had been a part of the Net Zero Emerging Leadership Internship Grant. And we took 3 of our projects, one kind of baseline code minimum. The second one was a passive inspired built project. And then third was built to passive house certification. And they all landed in alignment with kind of our expectations. But, even with our passive houses, we were under the marks for hitting AIA 2030 challenge. And it's only 6 years away. So we realized then that it is really important to kind of track your projects on multi-levels. Along with that too, the analysis of embodied carbon with passive house, operational and embodied carbon. It's kind of not making full reductions on embodied carbon is always the answer. We learned that it's really a lot of trade-offs. So a really efficient home can save you 3 times the amount of upfront carbon of a building, or of a in our case of homes within the first 5 years. So it's kind of trading scenarios for scenario is not it doesn't work here. Like every issue that comes up, you kind of have to look at it at different lenses, and that's kind of difficult. But as we kind of have had 3 years of experimenting with kind of engaging our firm and reflecting, that has gotten less daunting, and the information seems more clear, and the decisions to make seem more clear.
I'll offer this, that I think the conversation has continually evolved over decades and decades, but certainly since the launch of the 2030 commitment and other commitments. And particularly on the operational side, there was a sole focus on energy efficiency. as a means for carbon reduction. And that was great. And there was a lot of great movement around that. And we've made significant progress on through energy efficiency on a national scale. We've added something like 50 billion square feet of new construction to the US building stock, kept energy consumption level since 2005, and reduced emissions by almost 33%. That's a huge success story. A lot of that comes from energy efficiency. That's how we've kept everything level. It's new buildings, it's existing building programs, et cetera. And then the renewable piece is what's actually allowed us to actually reduce emissions. We kept energy consumption level, but we've reduced emissions by 30%. And that's because we're allowing for more and more renewables to come online. I think there's an evolution within the AI program that also starts to evaluate not just energy efficiency, which you can't win this on energy efficiency alone. By definition, we're not going to get to zero on energy efficiency. So we have to do our job on energy efficiency, but we also have to look at building electrification or other decarbonized thermal, and then moving into the renewables. And now the 2030 commitment program is starting to incorporate those so that more firms have the ability to not hit a threshold at 50%, but to get to 60, to get to 70, to 80, 90, and to net zero or carbon neutral. And so there's an evolution in the program, and there's an evolution in the way that firms have to think about operating emissions, not just through energy efficiency, but through systems, which involves the MEPs, and then through renewables, and actually talking to clients about either on-site renewables or renewable energy procurement, which is now also in certain codes on the IECC level. So there's an evolution there. And I would say we've done really well, as I know in some of the statistics, but on embodied carbon, we don't have the same kind of national data. We don't really have an idea. We've been basically doing our homework now, trying to figure out collecting environmental product declarations, doing life cycle assessments. What's a good building? What's a bad building? How different are they? What are the parameters? We knew a lot of that stuff from the energy efficiency movement since the 1970s to start collecting data. This is really new. And so it's easy, I think, to kind of get discouraged and wonder if you're making an impact on embodied carbon, but we just don't have the data yet to prove that out. And so we have to do more and more data collection, better understanding of what our opportunities are. And I think that's the new frontier here. But let's also recognize something that Mia said, is that this is also a movement towards a whole life cycle analysis. Not just on operation emissions and not just on embodied separately, but together, and recognizing that there are trade-offs. And there's a big movement in terms of policy in Europe and now in certain jurisdictions in North America that to a whole life cycle carbon approach. So you're going to look at trade-offs throughout, whether it is embodied carbon and operation.
Great. So it's so helpful to have this range of perspective. I'm super glad to have you here, Vincent. So thinking kind of at this sort of more of this transformative level, I think one of the things that Energy Trust has been really excited about having this, this little grant as a small way to move the market forward is that we're bringing all three of these commitments together, right? And you're all working on the same buildings, just from different disciplines. And I'm curious, and Vincent's going to talk a little bit about the ECHO project, but maybe before he gets into that, or I don't know if you want to pull up your slides or not, curious for the three firms, like what would you like to see and what are you starting to see around kind of finding more alignment across the design team, working with architects and engineers who now all have, not all, many of you have now shared commitment goals, and the hope is that more firms will sign on and it'll be easier when you're all approaching it from a similar way and with shared metrics. How do we find more of that alignment?
Yeah, and I know from our perspective, it's been tough. Like I've mentioned it earlier, a lot of times in the past, structural engineers have kind of been left out of the conversation, and just as embodied carbon has been left out of the conversation for quite a while. And I think my vision would be, that all project team members are kind of owning their portions of the building. We have the MEP engineer that's looking at their systems, the architects that's looking at the enclosure and the energy alongside the MEP, and then we also have the structure that's looking at the structure, and having all of that really come together and have a collaborative, process in which there's, more meetings throughout the project design process, and we're all coming together to see how we can optimize this stuff as a team. I think historically, I've more seen like some of the one person owning the whole building LCA and looking at all of that together. But I think at the end of the day, the opportunity to holistically reduce carbon, whether it's operational or embodied, just across the entire scope, will only be truly realized if we're all sitting at the same table and discussing where those synergies lie. So I think that's my vision, that's my goal.
Yeah, I feel sometimes it comes together at the end when everyone's doing reporting and they want to, we reach out to each other for numbers, and that's usually when an architect is getting this stuff together and it all comes together. It's and I would think structural engineers are also doing probably the most without being asked to actually cut material and make those big gains. They want a structurally efficient design, and so like I don't think owners understand all the carbon value they're getting from their designers necessarily, and that's why I think maybe benchmarking is something. If we could just start benchmarking stuff earlier on and it's saying this is where we're starting and this is how our design is going to help you get further. I think that's one promise we're excited about from the DDX, right? Is like if we could just have great data, like Carbon Leadership Forum is going to release their upcoming embodied carbon benchmark study. So we'll have better points of say like, hey, if we did nothing, this is where we'd start, but look, your team got you better than average. We'd be able to tell those stories and find those wins for owners and clients a little and describe them more clearly. In a way that we have been able to do with energy for a long time, but not for the integrated carbon story.
So I'll just touch on our firm as kind of how we kind of work with engineers. We don't really work in depth, I feel like with the MEP side yet, other than kind of, speccing typical passive house, fresh air ventilation and heating, cooling. But for engineering, we try to like specify less material. That's constantly kind of we get a bit of pushback. We try to push the bounds of safety factors, which is constant pushback, but it typically with more material, there's more carbon emissions associated with that material. So we really try to make reductions, and we're constantly kind of not arguing, but negotiating with engineers how much less concrete we can use. Is this really like what is necessary? Can we make different decisions here? And then making other trade-offs with other materials. But in terms of efficiency of mechanical systems, we definitely spec systems that are higher performing and last longer. And I think that some of those decisions just intuitively kind of help make reductions of long-term carbon emissions, but that's kind of just where we're at with trying to like integrate these three separate fields that are so connected.
Great. So I know Vincent's going to jump in, but I encourage you all to start thinking of questions. You can put them in the chat or be prepared to unmute yourself, and you can ask a question of anyone or to everyone.
All right. You see my screen there? Okay, great. So I just thought I'd share this. These are some slides from the new ECHO project, which I'll describe in just a second. But I think this is one of the main fundamental challenges. And Anti's talked about how this is done sort of at the reporting side. And so if all of these different commitments have different levels of ways of reporting embodied carbon or whole life carbon or any types of LCA, we're not even comparing fruit to fruit. It's not apples to apples. It's not even apples to oranges. It's all over the place. And what it's can make it really difficult. I think Jessica talked about how some of the architects take certain pieces, the structural engineers take certain pieces, MEP takes certain pieces. Who's responsible for what? How does it feed into potentially a common model, just like you do with BIM and design? That's not how it's being done with all these reporting standards. And so there's really difficult in understanding, okay, everybody reports, we get an aggregates idea of what each firm is doing, or we have an idea what the industry is doing by profession, but we really don't know how to leverage that information in order to do design better projects, again, to take that up front in the design project. So this whole variation of life cycle assessment is really, really challenging, and the commitments have not been great about interacting with each other, which makes a lot of sense. They're run by individual industry organizations that are meant to represent those professions. And so they don't historically have that kind of connection with each other the way that a firm might in a project, or even in firms that have multiple disciplines. So this is an opportunity to start developing more alignment on that. And so I'll mention this effort that started just over a year ago that we helped instigate with the Carbon Leadership Forum and building transparency and bringing together those that were currently or imminently gathering embodied carbon data for the built environment industry, creating tools and resources and building awareness. But it was really focused on those that were collecting the data. What kind of data were they collecting? I mentioned that the AIA 2030 commitment now collects embodied carbon data. It comes in one number, sort of like a dish that's served to you and it's already prepared. Okay, so what goes into that dish? Do we have an idea of how we can compare that to, the salad that we're getting from Jessica from the structural engineer side? So this idea of better understanding the ingredients that go into our meals and to the projects is really the intention here of the ECHO project for this case of reporting and being better aligned on what data belongs to whom and how we make sure that they're replicable and comparable. And so you see all the variety of different folks that are involved in this. This is not just industry commitment reporting folks like the AIA, the MEP 2050 commitment and the SE 2050 commitment with SEI, but also includes a broader set of built environment commitments as well, including the contractors commitment, which is being hosted by Building Green, and the climate positive design, which is for landscape architects, and an emerging one called Infrastructure 2050 by ASCE on infrastructure projects. We all have a shared material palette. We're all using concrete and steel and other building elements in infrastructure as much as we are in buildings, and they both contribute about equal amount of steel and concrete. So it's important for us to do these things together rather than building them in silos and then they don't work with each other. So that's the intention of the ECHO project. I should note, ECHO is a great acronym name for this initiative, which is the Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization Project. I will note that because of all these, I'll skip through a few of these, I'll come back to it, but the ECHO team, there's a group that's working on a state of play mapping about how all of these different professional commitments and the rating systems that are also collecting information about whole life cycle carbon, including LEED and ILFI, Envision for infrastructure, and sites for landscape architecture, all play together and make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So when you're putting together these models, that they can apply to either any or all of these projects. But I also mentioned public policies that include a number that are happening here in North America, but also relates to standards and guidelines, which you see on the right-hand side. It's funny, I think maybe we need to call this the Heckafecta. I don't know, do you call it that? Trifecta, Heckafecta? There's 6 of these things, actually. We don't have Infrastructure 2050 here. But back to the difference between all of these things, and this might be getting a little wonky, and I'm not trying to educate you because I'm really not the expert on this either, but there are what we would call a big S standard, which are standards that are developed by folks like ASHRAE or building codes like ICC, and those set certain methodologies around how we conduct different types of things, whether it's energy modeling, energy calculations, in this case, whole building life cycle assessment. And those follow certain guidelines that might come from ISO or these other things that I mentioned on that previous slide. But those are how you do it, or what to do and how to and put it together. But they're not necessarily telling you all of the details about what has to go into that dish that you're making. Again, what are all the ingredients and how much are you measuring them? And are you measuring them in grams or are you measuring them in pounds, right? So that's what's important about recognizing the schema effort, which is really one of the main efforts that the ECHO project is putting together. This is on the top right here. It's being led by Building Transparency, who you might be familiar with, that runs the EC3 tool, Embodied Carbon Construction Calculator, where they're collecting a lot of environmental product declarations. They took on the effort to harmonize all this stuff. They asked for every single field the AI 2030 commitment asked for. They asked for every single field the SE 2050 inputs into their database, every single field, the MEP, et cetera, and then worked out where there were discrepancies. Are they using whole total floor area? Or are they using a different floor area calculation? And so the effort is slated to be published here towards the end of the summer, early fall. And then I mentioned the state of play mapping, which is being led by Carbon Leadership Forum and includes all of this information. How does this all relate to each other? What else should you be aware of if you're looking at these? And again, whether you're doing this for best practices and how to understand and do better design, it's also coming into public policies near you. So be aware that some of these criteria might apply either for incentives or even regulated requirements, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto. I don't know how much of you all work out in those regions, but could be coming to Oregon. Who knows? So there's a lot here to be aware of, but don't worry, there's plenty of expertise. You don't have to become an expert in life cycle assessment. Carbon Leadership Forum has a policy toolkit that helps explain a lot of this stuff. And they're leading the state of play mapping, which they also plan to publish in the late summer and early fall. So this is the new world is beyond buildings, including the broader built environment, include your landscape architect, include your infrastructure engineers, and everybody else in the conversations, because you have shared goals and alignment. And we're trying to work together to make sure we're speaking the same language. I'll stop sharing now.
Thanks, Vincent. It's great to have that context of how this is scaling up. So that's super exciting to see all that momentum. All right, so who wants to jump in with a question for any or all of these folks? And it can be high level policy level or total brass tacks, like how do you staff this and get this done? Bio, go ahead.
Hi, thanks everybody. I don't know anything about any of what you're talking about, so this was great because it was a nice, intro for me. Mia, am I saying your name right? It's Mia, right? You mentioned and others, Vincent, you did as well, like the fact that it's a lot of like concrete and steel. And then Mia, you said like you're trying to like shave out the concrete as much as you can to like a safe level. How is like cross-laminated timber, how does that fit into this, like it's an embodied carbon? This is not a question for you, Mia, but a question for everyone. But you
Jessica's well suited to answer. I can also provide some feedback on it.
Yeah, I guess I'll go ahead first, since if you want to follow up on anything else. Mass timber is a really exciting emerging technology that we're seeing enter the structural realm these days. I think there's a huge rabbit hole that we could go down on that one, but I'll try to stay high level. But mass timber generally has a much lower embodied carbon footprint than a lot of the conventional building materials like concrete and steel. And effectively, it does also have some biogenic carbon locked into it. I don't think we want to go down that path today, but those are the very, distinct differences between, conventional materials and mass timber from the embodied carbon perspective. There are lots of codes that are coming out, updates to the IBC, in which we can start to replace some of those conventional materials like concrete and steel with mass timber. So we're finding a lot of success at DCI with bringing that material to a lot of more of our projects. We're also finding a lot of, dead ends as well. Sometimes mass timber doesn't work for every single project in every single region. And it doesn't always price out as much as we like it to for all scenarios, but it is a really great strategy to reduce embodied carbon. And it has a whole other, tons of other benefits in terms of biophilia, and if procured and sourced correctly, it can also help with forest resilience and a lot of just the list goes on and on. But that is one strategy that we try to utilize quite a bit in reducing our embodied carbon footprint through new construction, but also through renovation and adaptive reuse. Mass timber is a great material that you can use that has a lighter weight and allows you to utilize some of that existing carbon and existing buildings, and you can build upon it with its lighter system in conjunction with steel and concrete. So I don't know. I could go on about mass timber all day, but I don't know if you have anything to add.
Multiple webinars on mass timber. And Woodworks, if you are designing with mass timber, Woodworks is an industry organization that helps support design teams to do that work. If you're not familiar with them, I'd recommend taking a look at them. The Nature Conservancy, an environmental NGO, has used to, they don't talk about it as much anymore, had this framework they called the 3S framework. And this would apply to any bio-based material, mass timber included. And the 3 S's are sequestration, which is how much carbon the plant takes in and then puts and stores in the ground, essentially in the soil and its roots and everything else, and locks in through that. The second is storage, which is how much carbon is actually in that material. And then we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a quick second. And then the third S is substitution. And that's really what we're talking about for most of the conversation. Substitution is wood or other bio-based material instead of modern materials like concrete and steel. And there you're comparing things within the life cycle according to old standards that we talked about earlier that doesn't make, I don't know all the ISO standards, et cetera. But even in those cases, what Jessica's talking about is it tends to win out over concrete and steel. But the concerns are really in the use of wood or other bio-based materials are on sustainable forestry practices. And can we really value the sequestration or even the storage? And the storage actually is where we talk about biogenic carbon, which means how fast will that piece of wood go back into the landfill or even be incinerated, according to the Europeans, that's how they value it, and then go back up in the atmosphere. So how much can we actually take credit for any of that carbon on the storage side? And that is, jury's still out. So I mentioned the stuff on the ECHO project and aligning all the different commitments and what are all the values and what do we agree on and what don't we agree on. Biogenic carbon, not agreed on. So that's the storage piece. That said, if it was agreed on and if it was considered over the long run, we're going to reuse that piece of wood in the next project and in the next project, and it has a long life, mass timber wins out, or biogenic in general wins out very easily compared to all those others. But if you see comparisons in whole life cycle assessments between different product types, so concrete, steel, and wood or any other bio-based, usually they're close together. They're usually not considering biogenic carbon or storage. If you see it start to go negative, that's when they're considering bio-based carbon. So things to be considering if you're trying to make the case for it, whether or not you're considering or not. Again, jury's still out. Your choice as a profession, having backing, having a good story to tell, having good folks to say that back you up on those claims, that's what would be necessary in order to start to evaluate it.
Thank you both.
Great question. Very relevant to Oregon's industry. Okay, there's a question in the chat about how to think about existing versus new buildings in this space and valuing the embodied carbon of existing buildings.
That's a really great question, and it really was suggested, right? Is like, well, reusing a building is always the lowest footprint, and I think it kind of relates to a funny thing about reporting. Is we do a lot of projects that are about extending the life of a building that are not quote unquote like tenant improvements or major renovations. As engineers, we replace chiller plants or do behind the scenes infrastructure upgrades, and that stuff often does not get energy modeled. Often we don't even have a floor area in our own records associated with it. It's more like, well, we replaced a 100-ton chiller plant or something, you know, and that's there's a lot of missing data that I think, like, even to do any kind of reporting, you have to decide what a project is. And a lot of that stuff, we kind of like, we can't report on this. So it's missing from the data. And I'd be curious to know if on how architects and structural engineers, maybe structural, you're probably doing more ground up stuff all the time, but there's a gap in the reporting. But yeah, it's essential because, you know, if you can electrify an existing building, that's a real home run in terms of sustainability.
I can speak to in terms of trying to compare projects. We've done a lot of studies of our projects, and one that kind of stands out to me was while I was an intern at Green Hammer for the Net Zero Emerging Leadership Grant, we focused on a retrofit of a school, and they reused all of the structure. The siding was replaced because it was needing to be replaced, but essentially they saved and reused as much as possible. And then we're also very minimal about the new materials going into the building. And so this is a pretty large school, but it was maybe 20,000 square feet. So not like it was maybe like a more residential small scale school. And our passive house that we analyzed last year, multifamily dwelling, about maybe about probably a third of the size, probably had 4 or 5 times the amount of total embodied carbon. But in terms of you know, efficiency, the passive house and operational savings over time, who knows which one will win in terms of savings. So it's kind of one of those things that, again, you're not comparing apples to apples, and it's really hard to analyze a question like that on that scale.
Yeah, and I'd say on the structural side, I'm actually very much aligned with what Ante was saying. You know, we do a lot of measurements for new construction. I think I could probably count on my hands how many times we've done an assessment for an existing building, and that's frankly because it's just a lot more difficult to do those calculations. The Revit model and the material quantities aren't as easy to estimate whenever we're playing with with renovations, but in the ones that we have worked on, yeah, we've seen a lot of really good savings, and frankly, I mean, I'd highly encourage you to engage your structural engineer as early as possible whenever you're working on a renovation project. There's a ton of elements that, you know, we can play with to see how it might be able to support the new occupancy type. And don't start, you know, chipping out the foundation. Don't start chipping out the foundation and the slab on grade. There's a lot of carbon that can be saved, so it's a really great strategy.
And I'll just add that it is absolutely essential that we make the most of the embodied carbon we've already put into the built environment in the developed world, and allow for the carbon budget that is remaining to go for the areas of the world that still require development, both in their buildings and their infrastructure. And existing building reuse allows for that to happen. And we also get not just embodied carbon reductions by not having to build new buildings put as much materials into the building stock, but also opportunity to revitalize buildings for the community and reduce their operating emissions. I put into the chat a tool that Architecture 2030 collaborated on with designers across North America called the CARE tool, Carbon Avoided Retrofit Estimator, which is a good early design tool about evaluating reusing existing buildings versus building new, and looks at a whole life perspective, including embodied carbon and operational carbon, and looks at where the wins are for the smallest projects that might include just systems or even the envelope and other types of systems. So take a look at that. And I would say that reuse is one of the areas that we are really hyper focused on right now. If you look in the US, and that was noted in the chat, over half of architectural billings are renovation projects or existing buildings, not new construction. And this is a trend that has been growing since the recession. So this is not going down. We're going to continue to revitalize. We're sort of turning into Europe. We'll continue to build new, but Europe and a lot of folks are just working on existing buildings. That's what we're doing here. So where are there opportunities, as Jessica has said, even from a structural side, to make sure that we can keep as much of these buildings as possible. And we know that just the structure and substructure, if we reuse those, it can be between 70 and 80% of the embodied carbon of that building.
All right, well, we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to challenge each of you, if you can, in a few words, what is your recommendation to firms that are considering getting started in this? We'll do a quick round robin.
Just jump, sign in, sign on and start. I think just starting is sometimes the hardest part, but it's the first step.
That's my biggest word of advice is, yeah, don't be afraid to ask questions. I mean, go ahead and sign on, but once you've signed on, don't be afraid to ask questions, use your resources, and frankly, don't be afraid to make mistakes. I you know, this is still evolving every day. And I think as long as we're talking about the work and we're doing our best, I think that's pushing the needle.
I would encourage people to remember that it's a collective commitment. It's not a personal challenge, but something that you're doing with your industry, and take advantage of all the webinars, conferences, calls to learn from other people who can help you with this, because we're all going through the same thing. So don't suffer in silence. You know, even the email chain for AIA DDX reporting, there's always someone who's got a good question and someone who has an answer.
Yeah, and I just want to build on that, which is that you're definitely not alone. All of these commitments have some sort of mentorship program or some sort of staffing or Q&A, you know, firm to firm kind of approach. Some have, again, listservs or online databases where you can ask questions. And it's also it's not punitive, and it's also not publicly disclosed. So don't be afraid if you're not doing very well that you're going to get called out for that. You know, this is a learning process. This is done in aggregation of all of the industries that are reporting. That's what we're looking at. We're not looking at firm by firm or project by project. It's warts and all. And so it's okay. That's how we learn, and that's how we build a comprehensive data set to understand how we do better and better and better. So it's a way to address the question that's still in the chat now without you having to type it in as the seconds click down, is all of this is to help us do better projects to reduce emissions. And so, you know, we're not aligned yet on all of the data points. We're not aligned. We don't know what all of these numbers are really even telling us on the embodied carbon side. And that's what we need to still and learn from. What are the rules of thumb? How could we do better design from a structural standpoint for the materials as an architect? How can the mechanical engineers support the structural engineering reductions? How can the structural engineers support the mechanical engineer reductions? If we're not talking to each other, there's no way we're going to find those synergies in integrated design. And what's really exciting is that everybody's now at the table up front. Jessica mentioned how structural engineers were not part of this discussion. They are now. MEPs, I've always been a part of that because it's been on energy. They're leading on a lot of really important issues like refrigerants, right? So everybody has to be aware of everybody else and work together to achieve these goals.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. That collective action, collaborative effort, we're all in this together, and it really is an industry-wide commitment. So really want to thank all of you as panelists for sharing your experiences and taking the time to be here, and then all of you as participants. I hope if your firm has not yet signed on to one of these commitments, you are ready to go and make the case to leadership and sign on shortly. All right, thanks so much. Appreciate your time, and this is just the one of many conversations that we hope to be having in Oregon and in the Northwest. So more to come. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.